Great, thanks very much, and thanks for inviting me to have a chat with you today. Are you able to just put the slides up? Perfect. So I won't speak for too long, but I was going to do a bit of a sort of history lesson. How did we get here? Sort of main overview of the digital markets unit and what we're currently focusing on. And I'll keep it relatively short and very open for questions and discussion afterwards. So yeah, by all means, ask questions as we go through, but also, yeah, at the end as well. So I guess just a bit of a history lesson. How did we get here? If you move to the next slide. So I think we all agree and don't dispute for a minute that digital markets have brought significant benefits to consumers, businesses, and the economy more widely. However, also, I think it's very clear that the dynamics of digital markets have changed significantly. And we use this term we actually borrowed it from the House Antitrust Subcommittee report, but what were once scrappy underdog startups, and you think of Mark Zuckerberg on his Harvard campus building Facebook, are now undisputably the most powerful global firms. So why does that matter? Well, if you move on to the next slide, well, why are these firms so powerful? When we look at them, we often find that the lack of effective competition in that market is a result of specific market features. And we found this particularly when we looked at the online platforms and digital advertising market. So looked particularly at Google and Facebook in relation to their role in the digital advertising ecosystem. And we found things like network effects, economies of scale, the power of defaults, consumer decision-making, but also access to data, the importance of ecosystems, and sort of vertical integration. So firms actively building ecosystems of related products and services that reinforce and support each other. And that those market features can come together to give these firms a very powerful position. And as I say, I mentioned ecosystems, but actually I think it's important to note mergers and acquisitions as a key part of this story. And if you look at the sort of the history of M&A for some of the most powerful digital firms, you see them building these ecosystems actively. But again, well, why does that matter? Well, we found, as I say, again, particularly in the digital advertising market study, that the sort of accumulation and strengthening of market power by those firms has the potential to lead to significant harm. So that can be a poor deal for consumers and businesses who rely on those firms. So to make that real, if you think about digital advertising, you're thinking about, for example, the privacy standards that you're afforded when you use those products. But actually, for many businesses, it comes down to pounds and pence. There was a stat from the market study that essentially found a significant increase in the price of advertising, when using Google, when compared like for like with Bing, and that feeds through into the price that consumers pay for the goods and services that are advertised on those platforms. Often it's sort of people look past the impact on innovation, but we think that's probably the most significant harm, the impact on dynamic innovation. That there are consumers are missing out on innovative goods and services, either because the firms themselves aren't innovating because they're not feeling the competitive pressure to do so, but also because innovative competitors are being excluded or blocked from being able to compete with those firms, and the impact that has on consumers in terms of being able to take advantage of new products and services. And then fundamentally a less vibrant digital economy. If you don't have those new digital firms coming through, able to compete and challenge, that feeds through into, as I say, new goods, but new businesses growing, new economic growth, jobs, employment, all of those good things. So we think it's really, really important. And these sort of market features or these problems have been noted in a number of expert reports. not just the CMA's own work. So in the UK, we had this report by the Digital Competition Expert Panel, the Furman Review. As I say, the House Antitrust Subcommittee in the States. There was a big report for Vestager in the European Commission. So these have been found across a number of different reports across the world. Could you just move on to the next slide? And so fundamentally, what these reports have all found is sort of something needs to change, and the existing competition tools as they are not sufficient to address this problem. And that's largely because, well, they're very, very slow. So if you look at a lot of the sort of antitrust cases that have been pursued in digital markets already, 5 to 10 years to reach a result, by which point, the firm that is the complainant or has been the firm harmed as a result of the firm's conduct has exited the market long gone, and it's too late to actually do anything. The remedies are also backwards looking and case specific. So when you construct a remedy at the end of an antitrust investigation, you're looking at remedying that particular conduct. So you look backwards and you say, essentially, don't do that again. But what you don't do is sort of set a precedent for the market more widely to say, we would like you to behave like this in future. So you don't have that sort of forward-looking dynamic. And as I say, they're sort of one-time interventions. This is what I just said. I mean, focused on addressing past conduct as opposed to shaping future ones. And I think when you look across the globe, I mean, you see antitrust enforcers effectively playing whack-a-mole. You've got either lots of antitrust enforcers looking at very similar conduct across jurisdictions, and you finish one case and it pops up over here. And so a sort of increasing conclusion across the world that a new, and we say ex ante sort of forward-looking approach is needed to proactively try and shape the behaviour of these firms and to prevent harm arising in advance. So not just waiting for some kind of anti-competitive conduct to occur and wading in with enforcement, but actually saying up front, this is how we want you to behave, and working with the firms to prevent that kind of harmful conduct. If you move on to the next slide. So I mentioned the number of reports that have looked at these issues and concluded that, that change is needed. And as I say, in the UK, the most prominent was this report, which was published in March 2019, the Digital Competition Expert Panel. And that was the first report in the UK to say, right, we need a new pro-competition regulatory regime. And they coined this term, the Digital Markets Unit, said we need a new body, a new regulator, the Digital Markets Unit, to oversee this new regime. And the CMA then did its big piece of work on digital advertising that I mentioned earlier. And it took the sort of proof of concept, it took the ideas that Furman had put out and did a bit of a proof of concept. It looked at the issues in that market and said, well, given that we've looked at these issues in detail now, would a new pro-competition approach work in the way that Furman outlined? And determined the answer was broadly yes. So said again, yes, we really think we need this new pro-competition regime and this digital markets unit. So government took that and said, okay, great idea. Can we have the flesh on the bones, please? So we've got this idea of a sort of code of conduct and a new regulator, but what does that actually look like in practice? And it established this thing called the Digital Markets Task Force, which is what I led. It was housed in the CMA, but we worked very closely with Ofcom and the Information Commissioner's Office to provide pretty detailed advice on what does this regime actually look like in practice. And we delivered that advice at the end of last year. We recommended this new digital markets unit to promote the interests of consumers and citizens in digital markets through competition and innovation. And the role of the digital markets unit would be to oversee this new regulatory regime for the most powerful digital firms. And we term those firms that have strategic market status. And in a second, I'll talk through a little bit more what that regime looks like. But just, I guess, to join the dots, as you can probably tell, because I am a director in the Digital Markets Unit, the Digital Markets Unit is real now. It's been established within the CMA in a non-statutory form, but very much to prepare for the new regime. And again, you may have seen that government is now consulting on exactly what that new regime would look like, based very much on the advice that we put forward in the Digital Markets Task Force. And it's committed to legislating to put both the Digital Markets Unit and this new regime on a statutory footing as soon as parliamentary time allows. So in terms of where we are in the UK, we're consulting on a framework. We need legislation, but you have the DMU in a non-statutory footing, very much in preparatory mode. And again, I'll talk in a sec about, well, what is it we're doing in this sort of preparatory mode? But first, just to say a little bit more on what the SMS regime is that the DMU would be responsible for. So if you just flick onto the next slide. So there are essentially three key pillars of this new strategic market status regime. But first, just to say a word on strategic market status. So we put forward that strategic market status should be defined as, or the test should be, that a firm has substantial entrenched market power in at least one digital activity that provides the firm with a strategic position. So this would be an in-the-round assessment that would look at, as I say, an assessment of whether the firm has substantial entrenched market power. And I mean, anyone who's familiar with competition economics will understand that sort of the concept of market power and how you test that is fairly well worn. But also, as I say, a test that the market power gives the firm a strategic position. And what we mean by that is that the effects of the firm's market power are particularly significant or widespread. And we gave a couple of examples of when that might be the case. And that might just be as a result of the firm's size and scale, that the effects of its market power are particularly significant. It might be that the firm has a broad ecosystem and can use market power in one market to leverage or extend its market power into other markets. It might be that the firm acts as a gatekeeper for a particular group of customers or businesses. But we proposed an in-the-round assessment, as I say, based on these factors. And I guess I think you mentioned that, Oles, that you've been looking at the Digital Markets Act, and I can touch a little bit more at the end on what some of the key differences are between the UK proposed approach and the Digital Markets Act. But I guess to contrast it with the gatekeeper concept in the Digital Markets Act, the two are quite similar, but the tests are somewhat different. They're both trying to get at the same thing. But I think, the UK approach, as I say, is an in-the-round assessment. The Digital Markets Act is more, the gatekeeper test is more based on those sort of quantifiable, quantitative metrics. But ultimately, you're still trying to get, I think, to broadly the same thing. And just to clarify, our expectation is that the strategic market status test would only be met in relation to a sort of narrow group of the largest digital firms. And it would apply in respect of particular activities. So we're not talking about applying the regime to the firm as a whole, but rather where particular activities meet this test. And obviously, if you think about market power, you don't talk about a firm as a whole having market power, you talk about it in respect of a particular activity. So it bites in the same way that the EU approach does, in that it bites on particular activities. If the firm meets this test, then there are three pillars of the regime. The first is a code of conduct, which is very much targeted at managing the effects of the firm's market power. So preventing the firm from exploiting consumers and businesses who rely on it, or from excluding innovative competitors. And the code of conduct is a high-level set of principles that would be set out and that the DMU would be able to enforce. Again, contrasting it with the EU approach, lots of similarity in the sort of content that we would expect would be covered under either the EU blacklisted practices, grey list, white list, or the UK code of conduct. Ours is a bit different in the sense that our proposal is that only a high-level element of the code goes into legislation, and that the Digital Markets Unit itself has discretion to be able to set the rest of the code within the confines of what's set out in legislation, but to be able to tailor it to the particular firm or business model on which it's going to be applied. And we felt that was quite important given the markets that you're talking about. If you think about sort of digital advertising or mobile ecosystems, app stores, or potentially marketplaces, they're very different. And so the ability to be able to tailor slightly, we're not necessarily talking about wholesale different codes, but, you know, to be able to remove principles where they're not necessary because they're not relevant in relation to that market, or add principles which are particularly relevant, or to be able to tailor, you know, in this circumstances, this is what we mean, we felt was quite important. So, as I say, broadly similar content, but a slightly different approach in the UK. And I guess probably the other key difference is, whereas the sort of EU Digital Markets Act, there's obviously a blacklist, it's quite, you know, you cannot do that. I think because we were talking about a principles-based approach, it was sort of, the ethos was more in setting out in principle what you couldn't do, but there being perhaps a little bit more scope for sort of efficiency justifications, or the ability for a firm to say, well, the reason we're doing it is because it's really, really good for privacy or some other policy objective, and the DMU to be able to sort of factor that in. So that's the code. The second pillar of the regime are what we term these pro-competitive interventions. And the purpose of these is to address the sources of the firm's market power. So whereas the code is focused on sort of the harms that arise as a result of the firm's market power, the pro-competition interventions are about getting at those particular features that we talked about earlier that lead to the firm having a powerful position. So whether that be economies of scale, network effects, access to data, defaults, whatever it is. So these might be interventions like interoperability, so requiring a firm make a particular service interoperable, access to data, so requiring that a firm allow competitors access to third-party access to some of the data that they hold, choice screens, so giving consumers more choice rather than necessarily relying on defaults, could be these kind of interventions which are very much aimed at making the market more contestable. And we propose that the DMU would be able to examine the case for these kinds of interventions and to be able to recommend these kind of remedies where it felt that it was needed to be able to promote more competition in the market and more innovation. And then the last group of third pillar of the regime is the merger rules. And these were, the aim of these is to enable greater scrutiny of transactions involving SMS firms. And there are two sort of key elements to them. One is changes to the sort of notification and reporting requirements. So a requirement that the SMS firm report to the CMA all intended acquisitions, and then mandatory notification subject to some safe harbour exemptions. And that's slightly different to where we are in the UK at the moment because we have a voluntary regime. But also in relation to the substantive assessment, a proposal to perhaps use a more cautious standard of proof. So at the moment, the test at phase 2 is that the CMA can, block a merger if it, on the balance of probabilities, it feels there is likely to be a significant lessening of competition. The merger is likely to result in a significant lessening of competition. And the question is whether balance of probabilities is the right threshold, or whether actually, given the position of these firms already having strategic market status and the degree of, with these mergers, we always say there is a small chance of a very, very bad outcome, quite often, whether actually a more cautious standard of proof, so potentially something like realistic prospect, might be the more appropriate standard of proof in these kinds of, when you're reviewing these kind of mergers. So those were the proposals that we put forward in the task force advice. And I say Government is consulting on these at the moment. And if you very much encourage you to engage with that debate, if you're able to put forward a consultation, response to the consultation, setting out your views, very much encourage that. But also, I know government is very up for sort of just talking to people. I know putting a consultation response out through August is not always top of everyone's list. So by all means engage, even if you can't do a full consultation response. It's really important that we get the regime right. So that's where we are in terms of establishing the regime, but I'll just say a little word on what we are doing in the DMU itself at the moment. If you move on to the next slide. So as I say, we've been established in this non-statutory form to begin to prepare to operationalise key elements of the regime. And there's kind of 4 key things that we're focusing on at the moment within the DMU. First is continuing to work really closely with government on the sort of regulatory framework for this new regime. So as I say, there's the consultation open at the moment. Government, as I say, committed to legislating as soon as parliamentary time allows. There is evidently a lot of work that goes into crafting that legislation, and we're working really closely with government to support them, you know, in making sure that the legislation sets up the DMU in a statutory footing in an effective way, but also the regulatory regime. The second bucket is pure sort of operational preparedness, and I'm sure you can imagine what this entails, but it's, you know, very much thinking about, well, what budget will the DMU need? How many people will it need to work in it? What are the scale-up plans? You know, you can't suddenly bring hundreds of people in at once, so you've got to recruit over a certain period. Where are we going to be based? Are we going to be based in the CMA's offices? All those kind of basic operational questions that we evidently need to start thinking about. I mean, evidently a big one of those I talked about people, but it's also what kind of people, and bringing in the right people with, you know, real technical and sort of digital capability to be able to understand the, you know, the business models of these firms that we're going to be regulating. So that's a big focus of ours. Evidence gathering on digital markets. You will have noticed, I'm sure, that the CMA has a very live portfolio of digital cases using its existing powers, and that's really important. We can't, as an organisation, just say, well, we're going to sit back and wait for legislation. We have to be really actively tackling the harm to competition that we see in the market already. And so you'll see that the CMA already has a very active enforcement set of enforcement cases. So there is the Google Privacy Sandbox enforcement case. There is an investigation into Apple in relation to the App Store. There is one in relation to Facebook's use of data. And we also have a market study ongoing in relation to mobile ecosystems. So you'll continue to see you know, a very active CMA in relation to digital markets using its existing powers. But we're very aware that, you know, in doing that work, evidently we are building foundational knowledge that will be really important for the DMU when it does get its new powers. And then the last one is talking to people. And we're talking to a wide range of different groups, but there are 2 I was particularly going to draw out. One is the other domestic regulators that we work really closely with through the Digital Regulation Cooperation Forum. So this is Ofcom, the Information Commissioner's Office, and the Financial Conduct Authority. And there are a range of different reforms going on across the sort of policy sphere in relation to digital markets. So I've talked about the competition reforms, but there's also the Online Safety Bill, which some of you might be familiar with, which is around content and harmful content on platforms. So sort of racism post the World Cup, but cyberbullying, suicide videos, you know, really harmful content. So that the legislation for that regime is currently in pre-legislative scrutiny. And then there's also the data protection regime and potential reforms to that post-Brexit. So it's about thinking about all these different areas where there are sort of reforms to regulation affecting digital markets and thinking about them in the most coherent and joined up way possible. So that's what we're spending a lot of time doing with our fellow regulators. But then also our international counterparts. You know, we've mentioned the Digital Markets Act. There are these reforms in the UK, but also some of you might have seen the bills that have been put forward in the United States in relation to this area. And there are lots of other jurisdictions around who are thinking about changes in this area. So Germany had reforms to its competition regime. Australia are thinking about similar. So again, there's this need for regulators to work together to really think about all of these reforms in a coherent way. They may be big firms, but I don't think it's in anyone's interest for firms to have to jump through hoops to operate different regulation in different jurisdictions. So we would like, the most coherent regime we can have possibly internationally. So we're spending a lot of time talking to our counterparts in other jurisdictions, particularly through the G7. There's a big piece of digital competition work through the G7 that we're focused on to try and promote that sort of greater coherence across different regimes internationally. So I'll stop there. That was a sort of high-level overview of where we are in the UK, what we're doing in the DMU, and how our regime might compare a little bit to the Commission's. But hopefully that gives you lots of time for questions.